Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan. I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw, publisher of Reading the Pictures. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Hey, Michael.
Hey,
Weddings and
Karen.
coins and all kinds of things. Oh, my.
Yeah, it's almost hard to draw a rope around. These
It
images
is.
are maybe dangerous. I don't know.
Yeah, we're on this holiday weekend here, and there's summer starting, and the news continues on. Shall we get going?
Yeah, sure. It is hard to generalize about these different pictures. I guess we could say that we have rituals that are wonderfully unfamiliar and ones that are fatefully the same. So the first image is a Getty photo. It's a pool photograph, and the caption reads, "Meghan Markle leaves the Cliveden House Hotel accompanied by her mother, Miss Doria Ragland, ahead of her wedding to Prince Harry at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on May 19th, 2018 in Windsor, England." And I guess really briefly, we really looked at a lot of photos and really struggled to choose one, but it really emerged as we just looked at shot after shot that the real picture of this event was not one that took place, was not a scene that took place inside the castle or was during the ceremony, but was this photograph. So why don't you start us off?
Yeah. First of all, I will make a true confession that I did get up at 5 a.m. Central Time and watch some of the wedding festivities. I had to leave halfway through the ceremony, but the U.S. media helpfully replayed everything all day long for hours and hours, as we all know. So this photo is striking to me for a couple of reasons. And it really relates to, I think, the component of mother and daughter here. So the first, I guess, sense that this image gives me in a kind of emotional sense is a real kind of isolating, closed-in sort of sense. So you really do, I think, because you have the background of the cheering people, and you get the sense that they're in this car and they're waving. There's definitely this interaction with the crowd, but they're also kind of protected and isolated, and they're with each other. And to me, that was really striking. And I think for those people who paid attention to some of the themes of the wedding, there was this question of whether her father would be there to walk her down the aisle, and he ended up not being there. And then the plan was, the parents are divorced, the mother would ride in the car and the father would walk down the aisle, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, what's interesting is that this is, in some ways, a kind of a photo of these two women together, but sort of alone together. And there really was, to my knowledge, no other family of either of them there. So they're kind of, being tossed into this completely, what especially for Ms. Ragland must have felt like a completely bizarre environment, where you have this very common thing happening, which is, you're very presumably pleased and happy that your daughter is getting married and you're attending a wedding. So that's the first thing that strikes me, is that in some ways they're protected by the car, they're protected from the crowds, but I'm also really interested in their body language. The two women really mirror each other, not only because they look alike, their mother and daughter, but because their hands, the waving hands, are really kind of, if they put their hands together, they'd be clapping or high-fiving each other. And I thought that was an interesting kind of mirrored gesture. And then also just they're sitting so close together. And again, I think it connects to that sense that I have from this image of, that these are two accomplished women on their own who are, sitting very closely together. They're obviously very close to one another as family members, but they're also, it's kind of them. And then there's everybody else, right? The people outside of the car, and then all of the other people, in this strange family situation they're about to dive into.
And I think that's why people found the photo so powerful, was the proximity and the intimacy and the fact that they do. And it's funny because this picture that is about windows and glass and so you kind of get that effect of them. It's true, like that they could be clapping.
Yeah, and I think for a U.S. audience, and maybe particularly for women of a certain age in the U.S. audience who are interested in the wedding, I think Meghan Markle's mother is kind of your entree into this, right? Because she's the only normal person, from a U.S. perspective, in this entire affair. The daughter is a famous celebrity, so she is sort of this other world too. And so, to a certain extent, what's also interesting about the fact that I don't know enough about my very outrageously expensive cars to understand why the window is perfectly framing Doria Ragland's face in that rectangle. I don't know, are they open, are they closed, what the configuration of the windows in the car actually is. But the effect is that it's framing her face. And so in some ways that also, to me, echoed kind of a lot of the, I think, appeal to the US audiences of her, is this sense of, she's really the only person that the average US viewer would be able to identify with in this entire bizarre scenario.
And another reason is because Meghan Markle is also, from Hollywood as much as she's from now royalty. And so, her mother, in contrast, is a social worker in Los Angeles, who went to Fairfax High School, and she's and then the media is also emphasized descendant of slaves from Georgia, but she's really she's an everyday person.
Yeah, and in a world where you've got George Clooney and Oprah at your wedding, she's about as everyday as you can get. And I think also the photo in retrospect, I mean, because media organizations really did spend a lot of time on her, because she was sort of the unknown entity, I think, for most people, who, for a lot of those media organizations that follow the royal family, especially. And so I think because you identify with her, because she's this everyday seeming person, and because she's the unknown entity, media organizations did really kind of construct a narrative around her. And even the way the camera shot the wedding, there were a lot of shots of her, and sitting and just kind of taking in the atmosphere, and responding to what was going on around her. And so I think that was a part of that story too, for sure.
Yeah, you did see Grace under fire too, because the celebrities of all stripes make it look really easy when they're when there's events like this. And I think that Meghan's mother had been to a certain number of events. Of course, she's been to Hollywood openings and these kind of things. But still, I think people could tell that she was a little nervous, that there was a kind of vulnerability there that was extraordinarily refreshing. And by the way, the Rolls Royce is a 1950 Royal Phantom 4, and it was the same car that Prince Charles and Camilla Bowles used for the Prince William and Kate Middleton a wedding. And so even with the car, the limousine, beautiful car, you also get this kind of contrast of, we've got, we're not in Kansas anymore. It's like, this is not a fairy tale. At the same time, it is, that we have the mixed race princess, and, and how groundbreaking that is. The car helps accentuate that also.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me, as I think we move along to our next photo now, is the way that events happen right next to each other. So the media were very absorbed in the notion of the wedding, and at the same time in the U.S. we have yet another school shooting. Michael, do you want to do the caption info on this one?
Yeah, and just in terms of your intro, there's a very harsh cover of, I don't know if it was the Daily News perhaps, but they said, like, they do royal weddings and we do school shootings, so the two were actually juxtaposed in a pretty hard way. The caption on this reads, photographed by Brendan Smielowski, AFP, another Getty photo. It reads, a memorial for the victims of the Santa Fe High School shooting. And just a little bit of background on the photo and our choice. Um, we found that over the last, well, since Trump became president, that the New Yorker particularly has done just some really stellar work in terms of photo editing. And there's a kind of perspective and commentary just in this selection of images that has been really interesting and refreshing. They've become, I guess, what you could call a visual leader in the framing of political events. So just in the way of background, 10 people were killed and 13 were injured in this another horrific school shooting in Santa Fe, in the Houston metro area, including an exchange student from Pakistan, which had a whole life to it also visually, both here and in Pakistan. The student showed up in art class, and I guess what was significant for us before we really get into this kind of the dynamics of this image and the choice of this image by the New Yorker is, the dynamic of the visuals in comparison to, the last shooting, made at least most widely publicized shooting in Parkland. So the question immediately after this happened for us and for me was, how much are we going to see a revert back to this theme of thoughts and prayers versus, continued activism? Of course, maybe not of course, but as it's played out, I think because of the conservatism of this town and how much there's a faith community and people also have a very strong commitment to the Second Amendment, the images really did revert back to form. So that's just some context for the picture and
and
what you're making here.
For me, what's really interesting about Smileski's photo, to me, very much builds off what you suggested about how the way these all too routine school shootings are visually framed. Is it changing? Has it changed? What are we seeing? Are we seeing different stories or reverting back to previous frames? And to me, what I find really compelling about this photo is the way that the photographer condenses into the frame the kind of the ritualized labor of mourning that high school kids are now doing. The very top right of the frame, there's the therapy dog, right? They bring the therapy dogs to help people with grief and to come and be with people when these things happen. Then, of course, you have the white cross, obviously with the names, the hearts, the choosing photos to display, and then the fact that the two, presumably both high school students, based on the way they're dressed and this young man's hair, for example, presumably two high school students, but we don't see their faces. So if we think back to Parkland, it was a lot of talking to the media. There was a lot of emotion. Yeah, there was a lot of righteous anger. There was a lot of voice. I mean, we talked a lot about that when we looked at some pictures from Parkland a few months ago. And here, it to me is this picture is saying that there's also this ritualized labor of grieving and mourning that this generation of kids is just doing. And even the piece that this photo accompanies in the New Yorker, which interviewed people in town and talked to kids who were there, et cetera. The way they talked about that experience was kind of very emotionally knowledgeable, I guess would be the best way to put it. That people seem to be developing inner resources. And that's not to say that this isn't a tragic disruption and a horrible, horrible thing, but that to me, this photo really kind of just encapsulates this ritualized labor of the horrible thing. And for me, the therapy dog just punctuates it. Like the minute I noticed that that's what that was, I just thought, oh, wow, okay. we have all the pieces in place here for what needs to happen in these situations.
Yeah, I think the photo really does what you're saying, and you pointed it out, and it's worth punctuating how much, or let's just go back. Let's say if we're talking 2 years ago, or after Columbine, or after the shooting at the theater in Colorado, if we had seen a photograph, uh, uh, one photograph marking that event where we had one person whose head was cut off and the other person with his back to us, it would have been audacious. And at this point, and I think in the most unconscious and nonverbal way, and this is why I think it's a brilliant choice of photograph. It makes perfect sense. There is a kind of whether you're talking about ritual or you're talking about wariness, or almost like a kind of conscious resignation. It's just perfect how we only see this kind of, which picture are we going to put where, and one other thing, by the way, what I thought was really a fascinating touch with this picture. There's still also a lot of debate after this shooting about whether the shooter's picture should have been circulated and whether his name should have been circulated. And that one photo of him, that really close up with that big, round, fleshy face, has been everywhere and really in the mix. And when you look at this photograph and you see that I believe it's a girl holding this picture out, it's almost like, hey, take a look at this. And that picture has one of the victims, respectfully, has a little kind of strange similarity to that picture that we saw blasted everywhere of the shooter. It could be anybody. Is kind of, I think, kind of in the storyline here also. So I think that also is a really amazing feature, as interesting as the little sliver of the therapy dog.
Yeah. And then also the red hearts, to me, punctuate it. I mean, on the one hand, it's a very homemade, you could use a fancy word like vernacular kind of mourning. The red what look like felt hearts or cut out hearts. But the way they're positioned is interesting to me, so that there's one that's above the head of the young man kneeling down, and then there's one that's kind of punching at the gut of the girl. And and it makes me think like head and heart, or head and gut. I mean, in other words, this is incredibly painful, but at the same time, again, people are going through those rituals that you go through at these moments.
Wow, that's really nice. Yeah.
Shall we move on to our last image, which is again in a slightly different register? We're a little bit all over the place this week, but that's how the visual news rolls.
Like I said, it's like a really jarring combination of things, just like the news is and reality is right now. So I think that this kind of reflects that also.
Yeah.
All I have actually on for caption is the Korea Summit coin.
Yeah, we have no photographer. This has been all over the interwebs in a variety of contexts. I've now seen some appropriations because, of course, the summit is not happening as of today.
Daniel's version is pretty good.
Yeah. There's one of them with their backs to each other, and I love appropriations. So yeah, I guess so. There's a couple of things that strike me. I guess for me, the overall message, which I find interesting and perhaps a little disturbing, is the kind of visual equivalence that's happening here. So that you have the U.S. and North Korea. You have Trump and Kim Jong-un. They are literally eye to eye. Their eye lines match. The flags are represented. I suppose it's hard to tell a little bit in this image, but I suppose it seems like the American flag is creeping a little bit over onto the North Korea side. Like, I think it's slightly bigger. But issues. Again, it's the design is equivalent, right? And this is a genre, I guess, that they produce these commemorative things for these moments. And so this is, to commemorate the summit that maybe never will be. Maybe, yes, maybe. so I get, but it just, so if they took that genre of visual equivalence and put it onto here, that itself is really jarring and interesting and strange, I think. But also just the fact that they're roughly visual equivalent. Trump seems to have de-aged, I think, quite considerably in this representation. I did also see online a few days ago some conversation about whether they gave Kim Jong-un more chins than he actually has. So, maybe issues there. The whole thing is just bizarre. I'm not really sure what else to say.
Well, again, it's like Trump getting out ahead of himself. But I think what's really fascinating about this is how it coincides with all of this news coming out about the White House and Trump and corruption. And, that theme, or all of the news coming out, has been kind of obscured by a lot of these other events, traumatic events, but in this case, in some way, or literally a manufactured event. And this is Trump's MO, which is sort of like the distraction game. So, we don't know if there's going to be a summit or not, but, these two guys have a huge investment in Trump for his ego and Un for legitimacy in this thing coming off, and all this kind of buttering up. But, getting back to the whole issue about corruption, what's Trump about? And what's really becoming very apparent is it's about minting the presidency. It's all about coinage. And so I just think that this is terrifically ironic, especially if the thing doesn't, the summit doesn't come off. The other thing, by the way, in terms of the layout of this, is where I think the idea was to, and the White House always keeps telegraphing its venality or its incompetence, but they had the aim, I think, to make Trump look like the more solid one, the more historic one. But when you see that Un is positioned more at an angle, and Trump is really very, very flat in that kind of strict profile, Un looks just much more animated and dynamic, and Trump looks more just very this kind of cutout figure. And when you get the choice to do the design and that's what you end up with, again, you're telegraphing what the situation is. And I think here's just, the latest example.
Yeah. And I love that idea of minting the presidency, and counterfeit just comes to mind, right? So this coin now has no value, or it's fake, or people are now minting or making their own counterfeit versions. I have someone I know said, well, I have to buy one because one of us has to. We have to see this thing in real life, right? So the sense it's become, and one can then imagine Trump saying, well, look at all these coins we sold. Wasn't that popular? In other words, trying to spin the failure in some other way, because of course for him it's, and I think for North Korea too, it's about the optics, and there's a lot happening underneath all of that. But as we've seen, Trump is really not too interested in digging much below the surface in any of these contexts. And so in some ways, this is a kind of ideal example of that. Yeah.
Presidency that ends up on eBay, it's
Yeah, right. And these things probably will be incredibly valuable, maybe even now today if you went online. Yeah. Apparently just to anecdotal piece of info I scrounged up this morning, apparently the reverse of the coin is an image of Air Force One. I don't know why, but maybe you just put a plane there.
Then I just see that picture of him saying, Michael Cohen is my lawyer.
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So on that note, maybe it's time for us to wrap up, Michael. Do you have any final thoughts for us for the week?
I think we did pretty well. We squeezed all the juice out of these images, but I want to thank people for watching. And again, if you like what we're doing, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where we're doing a lot of microanalysis, and sign up on our website for our Reading the Pictures newsletter and our weekly, our week in review. Then we will probably be taking a bit of a break because of our respective schedules, but we're really happy with the way this is going. And I think later in the summer, we'll get back into a regular groove. So we welcome your feedback, especially on our Facebook page where we're streaming the live program. And we hope to see you soon.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.